Mr. President.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise, as so many of us have done on this day, to do a couple things. Number one, to reflect and remember. That's important for so many reasons, but we're also here, I think, to express gratitude and commendation for so many who work in this building, the staff, the Capitol Police, and so many others who kept us safe 1 year ago today on that awful day. And I'll get to some other issues in a moment, but I want to start with just some reflections of what I remember about that day, but also what I think the country experienced on a day of horror and terror and desecration, a day when a group of Americans came to this building to stop the counting of the electoral votes. And they were told to do that by the then President of the United States. We know all the death that ensued from that, especially of law enforcement officers, and something on the order of 140 injuries, some of them grievous, permanent injuries to law enforcement, all based upon the violence, based upon a big lie, a deliberate falsehood that started long before even Election Day, started during the course of the 2020 election. But despite that big lie, and I don't want to spend all of today talking about that, but despite that big lie and the violence that flowed from that big lie and the near collapse of our democracy, despite that, we know that something on the order of 60 judges throughout the country, federal judges, state judges, appointed by Democrats, Republicans, and even some appointed by the former president, called out that big lie by rejecting the arguments based upon that big lie in about 60 different matters before those judges. So we know what happened, and I think the January 6th Commission will continue to put the evidence on the record and hold people accountable. But I think on a day like today, I want to focus on two issues. One is to express that gratitude that I mentioned before. The thousands of Americans who work in this building, the thousands who are not members of Congress who helped us on that day, everything from getting us to safety to making sandwiches for us when we were in a safe, secure room, something that basic. But of course, so many Americans now know, after all these months have unfolded, about the sacrifices made by so many on that day, especially law enforcement. But people in this building, who work in this building, have done so for years. They too were terrorized on that day. It wasn't just members of Congress and the nation more broadly. We even had the image, the horrible, disturbing, racist image on television of an American walking through the halls of this building with a Confederate flag. Never happened before. Not even during the American Civil War had that happened. So when we talk about those who have done so much, here's what we're talking about. We're talking about people who suffered devastating injuries, as I said before, some of them lifelong. The emotional toll that this violence imposed upon members of the staff here in the building, both during the siege and its aftermath, is almost incalculable. So we're grateful for their service on every day of their work, but especially on that terrible day. I also want to thank, and we can't do this enough, we could do it 1,000 times and it wouldn't be enough, to thank the United States Capitol Police and the Metropolitan Police Department for all they did to protect us, to ultimately quell the violence, and to literally protect our democracy. These officers were bruised and beaten. They were attacked with bolts and bricks and bats and bear spray, as we saw so much, as well as stun guns. They had broken bones They had concussions, chemical burns, scars, stitches, on and on. That's what violence does to a human being. They were also subjected to, those who happened to be black Americans in law enforcement or in communities of color, they were subjected to horrific racial epithets, the kind of language that should never be tolerated, not only here in the Capitol, but anywhere in our country. Some of them were even attacked by an American flag, by a flagpole with an American flag on it. So what this all adds up to is, unfortunately, not just a mob going into a building. This is about domestic terrorism. And I think it's an important day to be thankful that so many stood up to that domestic terrorism in law enforcement. So we offer both our gratitude and try, as inadequate as it is by mere words, try on a day like today to bestow some measure of both gratitude and commendation for what they did on that day. But finally, Mr. President, I think today is a day for resolve, to be determined to take action, legislative action. The best way we can do that is by passing the Freedom to Vote Act. That's the best thing we can do, not only for the next couple of weeks, but really it might be the most important thing that any of us work on. And I want to thank Senator Klobuchar and so many others who have worked on these issues, not just in the aftermath of January the 6th, but for thinking about the future of our democracy, literally the future of whether someone will have a clear pathway in the right to vote. The ability to vote in ways that so many Americans were able to vote in the midst of the pandemic. You know, there were a lot of people back in 2020 who said, oh, you know, in Pennsylvania you had a big turnout for president in 2016, but that turnout's going to go way down because it's a re-election and there's a pandemic and people won't vote and people will be afraid to vote. Guess what happened? We went from about 6 million votes in 2016 to almost 6.9 million votes. So almost 900,000 more people voted in Pennsylvania than did just 4 years earlier. Probably the highest turnout in more than 120 years in our state, just like it was for the nation. Now that didn't happen in our state just because people were more interested. It happened because we had pathways by way of a change in state law to allow them to vote. Very similar to what we're trying to do by enacting into law the Freedom to Vote Act. Being able to vote early, being able to vote by way of a mail-in ballot, having a drop box. What if you're 90 years old and you live in a rural area in Pennsylvania? We got 48 rural counties, by the way. What if you live in a rural area and you can't get to the county election bureau to drop off your mail-in ballot? Shouldn't you have a drop box if you're 90 years old and you want to vote? What if you live on a farm? What if you're running a farm and you've got a busy life or you're running a small business? Shouldn't you have the opportunity to vote? Or should you just be restricted to one day in the year? One day per year, every year for a general election. And if you can't get to vote that day, then you're not able to vote. Why would we go back to those days? But apparently a lot of people in this chamber are supporting efforts all across the country, hundreds of voter suppression bills. As Reverend Warnock said, seems like some people don't want some people to vote. I don't understand that. After we had record turnout in Pennsylvania from 2016 to 2020, because we had different pathways for people to vote. That's what we're trying to do with the Freedom to Vote Act. To have national standards so people will have a chance to vote in the way that they want, in a way that's helpful in terms of their family life or their work life. But we're at a point now where the big lie is perpetuating itself in more ways than one. Let me conclude with one thought. My hometown newspaper, the Scranton Times-Tribune, published an editorial today. And I would ask, Mr. President, for consent to submit as part of the record and part of my remarks an editorial entitled, "Long Year After 1/6/21, It Continues," which is dated today.
Without objection.
I won't read all of it, obviously, but the point that this editorial makes is the attack continues today. It's not over. It's not some event in the past that we are just reflecting upon. As important as it is to reflect and remember and offer gratitude and commendation. But here's what the editorial says, and I'll just read a short portion of it. It says, "The attack continues," and I'm quoting. "It carries on in state houses like Pennsylvania's, where lawmakers continue to question the outcome of the 2020 presidential election, the most transparent and heavily scrutinized vote in our nation's history. Craft bills to diminish the sort of heavy turnout that carried Joe Biden to victory, waste public money on fraudulent searches for fraud, gerrymander congressional districts in the cause of minority rule." And it goes on from there, saying that the attack continues by all of this work to lie about the election of 2020 and to pass voter suppression bills all across the country. The good news, Mr. President, is that's not going to happen. We are not going to allow a partisan minority to prevent us from passing legislation to keep that pathway to the right to vote clear in the ways that it was clear, so that so many Pennsylvanians and many Americans, as I said in my home state, hundreds of thousands more voting in a pandemic than voted just 4 years earlier. So, Mr. President, on this day, when we remember with horror that day just a year ago, and we say thank you to those law enforcement officials and others who work in this building and did so much for us and for the nation, we also are determined to move forward, to protect our democracy, and ensure that this great American experiment continues for generations. Thank you, Mr. President. I would yield the floor.